let's take a look at our top selections for Dan Illman, Mike Beer will be celebrating the New York Reds at Belmont Park on Saturday, New York Showcase Day, featuring the Empire Classic. Let's throw up the field for race number 10 at beautiful Belmont Park. It's a one-turn mile and an eighth. $175,000 is the purse for this year's edition of the Empire Classic Handicap. And Mike, there are two main protagonists in this race. The number 3 Funny Guy, who's stretching out off a good second behind the Breeders' Cup bound Firenze Fire in the Vosburg, and the venerable Mr. Buff, who just loves a mile and an eighth.
Yeah, Mr. Buff has been the leader in this New York division, especially for dirt routers, Dan, over the last 2 or 3 years. He's just been nearly unbeatable in these races. So we'll see if he can turn his form back around here as they, bring him back to New York bred company. And Funny Guy just sort of feels like the up and comer in this division right now.
Let's take a look at the time form US pace projector, because we know that the number 2 Mr. Buff, he likes to hear his feet rattle in the opening portion of the race, but so does Seafoam. And Seafoam's last 2 races have kind of come out of nowhere for Christophe Clement, both of them gate to wire. I think Seafoam's going to be aggressively ridden, but if you're on Mr. Buff, you just got to send, right?
Yeah, I mean, he likes to get forward. I mean, I feel like at least in Mr. Buff's situation, he doesn't absolutely need to be making the pace down. I think he wants to be up close, but he's certainly capable of stalking and then still producing a good effort. It feels like with Seafoam, they really only have one way to go with him, and they're just going to have to put him on the lead. If he runs the race that he ran last time at Saratoga, where Joel Rosario just took no prisoners with this horse and went a wicked fast pace and still held on, if he runs one of those races, I guess he could be really tough in here.
Horse sitting in third in the early portion of the race, according to Time Form US, is the number 1 Our Last Buck. Boy, Michelle Nevin's done a real nice job with this courageous cat gelding. Last 5 starts, 3 wins, 2 seconds, including this victory at Belmont last time out, going a mile and a 16th on October the 8th. We watch Our Last Buck in the pink silks on the outside take control, and he's very, very game in the stretch to hold sway. He earned a 90 buyer 3 starts back on a wet track, Mike, and I like his versatility and his tactical speed. I just wonder if he's good enough to beat the big 2.
Yeah, that would be my concern with him as well. They're going to step him up here and try a much tougher race for this horse. But you're right, he's in very good form for a trainer who's having an excellent Belmont meet so far. I thought our Last Buck ran well last time. Manny Franco rode him with a lot of confidence, Dan, just sort of kept him 4 wide around the track, and he worked really hard to beat that field. So that's the sort of race that sort of makes me wonder if he's really good enough to beat this field, but he is certainly in good form right now.
John Kimmel really tested Mr. Buff in his last 2 races outside of New York bred competition. They tried Tacitus in the Suburban. He didn't make the lead in that race, and he paid the price. And last time out in the Whitney, he's just not going to beat Breeders' Cup Classic bound Improbable, by my standards, Tom's d'Etat, 3 of the better handicap horses in the country. Mr. Buff gets the class relief. He's going a 1-turn mile and an eighth with speed, and you can never count this horse out.
No, you can't. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's just, the horse to beat in these longer distance dirt races for the New York breds. I mean, he just has that track record of always being very tough to handle in races like this, Dan. I'm, perfectly happy to give him a pass for the last 2 races. He is not an open kind of graded stakes horse. He was never going to be competitive with those horses, and he didn't run well in either the Suburban or the Whitney. I was a little more concerned about his commentator, Dan. I know it was a 1-turn mile, but he's been perfectly fine at a 1-turn mile throughout his career. And listen, he ran a 98 and finished second. I just didn't think that was one of his better efforts. So that race concerned me a little bit. The mile and an eighth actually works to his advantage this time.
And you mentioned the commentator. Funny Guy was returning off a lengthy layoff in that race. He received a nice trip up the rail. He was able to defeat Mr. Buff. He backed that up with a win at Saratoga in the Morrissey. And he's performed well in 2 subsequent graded tries, including this race, the Vosburg against Firenze Fire. And I just don't think the trip really worked out for Funny Guy in this race. He ended up 4 wide all through the turn. There wasn't a ton of pace here. He's on the far outside, and Firenze Fire is just a better horse than he is. He ran fine here. He won the Albany at a mile and an eighth last year. Personally, I think he's slightly better going shorter, but it's nice to know he can get this trip.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. He might be a little bit better going shorter than this, but you're right. He's also shown that he can handle the 9 furlongs. Not only did he win the Albany as a 3-year-old, but I thought he ran sort of an underrated race in his next start, the Oklahoma Derby, when they shipped him down to Remington. That was also at a mile and an eighth. So I think he's very versatile in terms of running style. He's very versatile in terms of distance. He's come back, I think, pretty clearly an improved horse so far as a 4-year-old. And as opposed to Mr. Buff, this horse actually held his own in graded stakes races in his last 2 starts. So there's just a lot to like about Funny Guy. It just feels like he's coming into this race the right way.
Perhaps the number 4 Chestertown just needed some time to mature. He sold for $2 million as a 2-year-old in training. He's got that beautiful pedigree, being a son of Tappet, and he finally put it all together in the Albany last time out. Let's watch that race, going a mile and an eighth. It was his second race with blinkers, and I think you could throw out the first one where he was in against Tough Open Company in the Peter Pan. He's the gray horse. He seems very focused in this race, very game. Co-career best Beyer speed figure of 85. He gets weight from the big 2, and he has some upside.
Yeah, those are all the things to like about him. So far, he hasn't run a race that's going to make him that competitive with the favorites in here, but you have to like his upside. He's obviously very well bred. He's supposed to have no problem with this distance. And you just, you wonder, is this the time that he's going to take a step forward that he needs to take? I thought his Albany was fine. The race 3 starts back at Belmont Park when our last buck beat him. This horse was in contention when he just bolted at the top of the stretch. That's why the blinkers went on. And it feels like the blinkers have done their job, Dan. He's going to have to improve to beat this field. Maybe he can do it.
The Asmussen barn also sends out the 5 Banket, and I'm starting to get a little bit tired of Banket's act. He rarely wins. He often puts in a good late run to get a piece. He was likely overmatched by Mr. Money and Company in the Open Ack last time out, and maybe a 2-turn 7 furlongs at Charlestown isn't his game when they ran him in the Russell Road. But Funny Guy had his number 3 and 4 starts back. He's the kind of horse that's going to linger near the back of the pack, hoping for this pace to fall apart late.
Yeah, he wants some pace in front of him. And he's got plenty of races on the go back that would give him a real chance in here, Dan. He's run several speed figures that make him a real player in this race. But as you've already pointed out, it just feels like he doesn't get there ever in his races. He's always making a late run. He's always coming up short. I'm with you. I kind of just would prefer to use him underneath in this race. But, I'm not going to kid myself here and think, that he can't win this race, because he's got races that would make him very tough.
Number 6, Winston's Chance. This is a horse he's a little bit underrated. He's got 10 lifetime wins. Let's go back to his most recent start, Open 62.5, optional claiming race. He's going to finish a decent third. Now, Winston's Chance, you see him in the black blinkers. He briefly has the lead. Empty Tomb's going to go by him, and Winston's Chance will eventually fade just a bit to finish third. We know what we're going to get from Winston's Chance. It's usually a Beyer speed figure, high 80s, low 90s. If Mr. Buff and Funny Guy come to play, he'll have to do a little bit better, and he kind of likes to be up close to the pace. Maybe chasing Mr. Buff isn't exactly the trip you want if the pace is solid.
Yeah, I think it feels like there are a few things working against him. He's a really nice horse, as you said. I agree with that. I think he's very underrated, and he's a multiple stakes winner versus New York breds. But this is just kind of a tough spot for a horse like him. He's actually run pretty well in all of his starts since David Donk took over. It just feels like a race like this is a little too tough for him. And the trip that he wants, he may not be able to get.
Seafoam returned from the mandatory break with 2 giant victories, one at Belmont against New York breds, where you and I could have had him for $40,000. And then this race at Saratoga, going the 2-turn mile and an eighth, where he was just able to go to the lead. And he sets a very legitimate pace here, Mike, and he keeps on going.
Yeah, this was kind of an amazing win, actually. I got to admit, Dan, I've never been that big a fan of Seafoam. He's certainly run some good races for Christophe Clement along the way. But I just never have been a big fan of his. His win 2 starts back when he also wired a field and he was basically ridden out that day. He just got control of the pace. I still wasn't sold on him after that race. This race, if nothing else, has to make you take a second look at him, because they went a legit pace up front in there. As I said, Joel Rosario, he never rated this horse at all. He took no prisoners on the front end and just let this horse roll. And he still managed to hang on at the end. I thought he ran really well last time. If he runs a race like that, I suppose he could be dangerous in here.
Evaluator pulled off another turf to dirt victory in his most recent start. He seemed to really appreciate the wet track. Let's watch Evaluator run away and hide from 2 other than New York bred competition. He just loved this wet track. Our last buck can't stay with Evaluator. This race came back really slow, only a 78 Beyer speed figure. But this guy's run some good races, especially at a mile and an eighth in his career. I guess at a price he has a puncher's chance, but he's going to have to run the fastest race of his career by far.
Yeah, I think that's all. I think all those things are true. I personally feel like that figure's a little low for that race. That it can't have been an easy figure for them to make with this horse winning off by the length of the stretch on a wet track. But I think it might have been a little bit low. This horse got a great trip in there. Our last buck was dueling the pace up the back stretch and was very tight. You could see in the replay he had nothing left through the stretch. But this horse ran well, and as you've already said, he's got races on the go back that are a lot better than that one. I feel like this horse has an outsider's chance in this race.
And this pace could be legitimate. You've got Mr. Buff, you've got Seaphone, you've got Winston's Chance. Maybe it heats up a little bit. We take a look at our top selections for the Empire Classic. I'm going with Funny Guy. He's got a little more upside than Mr. Buff. He took the measure of Mr. Buff back in that commentator at Belmont. I think 1 1/8 will be fine with the right trip, and I think he's going to get the right trip.
I mean, I feel like we look at it the same way. And, I don't want to be too hard on Mr. Buff in this race. I'll actually, part of me will be rooting for him because he's a really nice horse. And I'd like to see him get back on track. I'm just not really sold on his current form, Dan. So I feel like this is the time to take a shot against him. And I think Funny Guy's the right guy to do it with.
I agree. 3258 for Mike, 3576 for me. It's the Empire Classic, race number 10 at beautiful Belmont Park on New York Showcase Saturday. Best of luck.